presentation, I will engage with Amman's modernity in two ways. The first is by looking into how Amman was part of this multifaceted project of Nahda, Arab's project of modernity, which is a socio-cultural project in its core before being an architectural product. Then, after discussing how this project was trying to make a shift through several fields and producing these models of modernity. Then I'll look into how this project was reflected in Amman through testimonies from one of the understudied areas and historical cores, which is Jabal al-Hussein. Tariq al-Aris best describes and writes about this project. I find his description as one of the best description. He describes the true nature of this period. He says that Nahda was a process of trial and institution building, fascination with and criticism of European modernity, and systematic incorporation and reassessment of older Arab models of learning and community. And here, this is what is important. His words, criticism and reassessment, are the most important words when we describe Arab Nahda and Arab modernity. It was not simply an imported product. We can sense that very clearly when reading from Ahmed Faris al-Shidia, for example. We sense his struggle in his encounter with modernity in Europe. He was judging, he was criticizing, he was in a continuous pain until he reached into his product, his writing, his text, his descriptions. So what really happened at this period is a shift in the fields of knowledge that touched people's lives. And this is the main point here. So the communicated content in the Arab world has shifted. This is my main point of view in this presentation, how we should start looking into Arab modernity by first looking into the voices behind this movement, which are hidden in historical text. And this is what I did. So I started thinking that this huge number of text, which was produced by scholars at this period, needed to be analyzed, needed to be uncovered in order to understand the drivers of change that then produced finally the architecture. We can take, for example, the text that varied between religious texts, Muhammad Abdo or Muhammad Farid Wajdi and many others. In journalism, for example, journalism was created at this period. There was no journalism before Nahda, and this is very interesting. Journalism was created to disseminate science, political thoughts, literature by scholars like Boutros el-Bustani and among many others. There was an amazing shift in linguistics by, for example, Ali Basha Mubarak. The language that we speak now was created at that period. Those new terms were created to adapt Arabic language to the new scientific knowledge that was imported from Europe. So what we speak now was created at that period. This is what is very important to know. Some of the terms, as I already said. Of course, there were other fields in literature. For example, we can talk about Mayziyada and others. So I actually started asking those text questions. Those questions revolved about Nahda. I tried to uncover the themes, the trends, the patterns of thoughts, the changes that were communicated to the Arab public that actually changed to some extent their thoughts and prepared them to embrace modernity. I mean, it was not an easy task to make this shift. People had to be convinced that this product was not an alien thing. And before actually experiencing these new spaces, materials, forms, they had to be prepared. And then I asked these texts how Amman was aligned with this product of modernity before studying Jabal Hussein itself. These texts actually answered me. How? I used the content analysis method. It is, it is completely different than a mere literature review. You take a paragraph, you try to ask it a question, then you read it and reread it. Sometimes I spent many nights and sometimes a whole month going back and forth to many texts to get some trends. What was this writer trying to communicate? Sometimes the writer himself did not write these clear thoughts, but after I read for so many of them, those trends of thoughts and families of thoughts becomes clear to me. So this content analysis method is usually used for political speeches, for the communicated content, for example, for the media, to know the effect of this media on the public, how it changes them. The results that occurred to me were 45 reoccurring themes of the communicated content. I grouped them into families to make it easier to me to understand what happened at that period. There were modernity أو تمدن, definition, requirement, and results. The reasons, they discussed reasons behind regression, expanding modernity scope, and relating and locating the Arab world within the wider context. So modernity أو تمدن. If people were to embrace modernity, they had to understand its meaning and be assured that it was not a threat being imported from the West. Of course, they had their doubts. So on the contrary, they made it clear to them, those writers, each from his own background, they made it clear to them that it was all about science, tamaddun, and bringing back the glorious days of the Arabs. And embarking on several projects. It was all about projects that would touch all aspects of their lives, and that they themselves should be part of this project. We're not going to impose those projects on you. This is essential. So they should participate. They should be part of these projects and not to be only recipients. Those writers, too, they got really obsessed about the reason behind the Arab regression. They started locating themselves within their wider context because they traveled to Europe. Most of them traveled to Europe. So they witnessed this huge difference between these two words. They started coming up with answers and solutions. Those solutions included union, science, patriotism, and started to disseminate these solutions to the people. Now, this is very interesting. As Tamaddun was discussed by people or scholars from different backgrounds, every one of them discussed the problem or the issue from his background. Scholars from architecture discussed it as Imran. The journalists discussed it from their own point of view. So you can, when you read about Tamaddun and this period, you have this huge perspective where you can really get a good, very good perspective of this Nahda as a whole project. For example, these pictures are from Majallat al-Umran, and this text is from the opening of that Siraj al-Din wrote from the first issue of Majallat al-Umran. He says, "Thanks God who helped us to accomplish one of the nationalist wishes and establish the foundation of our scientific Nahda, which is the magazine of architecture, to express our engineering thoughts and discuss our theories and creations, and all our innovations in architecture and engineering to be the messenger of scientific and artistic culture." So Siraj al-Din starts his magazine by confirming his nationalist thoughts, setting Nahda as his project. So he's talking about an architecture point of view, but he's discussing Nahda and nationalist thought, but he's confirming too the innovation and knowledge that they are the roads towards it. So in this very short text, he discusses 3 themes that I found common amongst all the other scholars that comes from different backgrounds. This is the main theme that I found with all the texts that I analyzed because they were worried about this issue. They were in agony. They were in a complete debate. Are we importing this Nahda? What are we going to do with it? They were in struggle. One of the writers, for example, he fell sick after his first visit to Paris. Before he reached into balance, that he described laterly on his text, Ahmed Faris al-Shidyaq, of course. He said that this is the only way to embrace modernity. The only way is to domesticate it. We have to have an input in this modernity. This modernity should be a hybrid in forms, in thoughts, in spaces, in terms, and in everything. It should not be imported. Now, for the text that talked about Amman's heritage of modernity, it shared with the other texts from the other world almost everything. So I'm gonna focus only on the last two concepts that are the spread of education. It was actually the result of the whole Nahda project of sending students to Europe, which after they came, they embraced the project, either by spreading their thoughts or by, after that, being a part of the government itself. So they started building those new schools and colleges, and then sending the second generation of students. Those students, when they came back, they formed the second generation of scholars. One of them were the retaining architects, who were not only influenced by the modern education and experience they gained in Europe, they were influenced by the built environment itself and the context in Europe. So it was not only about the education, it was about the experience in those cities. I can mention of them, Dr. Rami, of course, mentioned the Sayiq. There's also Nabilsi and Al-Muhtadi. They all contributed in the architecture in the city and in educating, of course, the other generation of architects. Now I'm going to move to the second part of my presentation where I reflect more on Amman through the historical area, which is very dear to my heart. It is Jabal al-Hussein, where I try to demonstrate how the social life of the residents was formed and formed the architecture. I did an intensive survey that covered so many parts, but I'm gonna only cover a few of them in this presentation. So Jabal Hussein is an understudied and underrepresented area. The history of Jabal Hussein can best be narrated through a testimony from Madame Siham Faraj, who spent her childhood in this house. She told me, through his testimony, she convinced me more of how modern architecture in Amman is a hybrid and a continuous dialogue. She told me about her father who returned from Europe and wanted to build a modern house. So he hired an architect, but he insisted on adding and altering to the design himself. He had a say in the space and in the material. She told me how they used the outdoor spaces and their new modern large terraces and this strong relationship with the street, where each evening they were the only family in the street who had a TV. So each evening they took this TV to the terrace, and then the adults would watch the news, and the kids would play on the outside areas, in the streets, in the rich terraces of the house. Her father specifically told the architects to design open salons, large open salons, so her mom would enjoy the weekly reception for ladies, which was at that time a trend. And she, as a kid, could take a peek through the large windows to look at those marvelous ladies. Even there was delivery service. It was provided through taxis at that time, where bakeries delivered pastries and bread to doorsteps. I mean, this is modern life in Jabal Hussein at that period. Through this witness, it shows something very significant. Jabal al-Hussein demonstrates how practicing modernity in Amman was actually about dialogues. It was a dialogue between the owner and the architect. They had a say. Between the residents and the spaces, the indoor spaces, the outdoor spaces, how they used it, and between the building and its context. In order to understand how Jabal Hussein was formed, and of course the rest of Amman hills, it started to be inhabited if we looked at the chronology here, it shows how the oldest areas, of course, were inhabited at the bottom of the hill around the Qal'a and slightly up the mountains. But with the surge of building between 47 and 56, it went up the hills and mostly in locations around the public buildings such as Kulliyat Di La Salle, Amman College, and Nazar School. What affected building relationship with their surrounding is, and how people interacted with their context, is the issue of the small parcel size. And it's apparent all around Amman, historical cores of Amman. 51% of the lots were planned to be between 400 and 600 meters square. Few lots were designed to be larger, but those lots were mainly for schools and governmental building. So those small plots of land that can be seen all around the historical cores of Amman created strong relationship between neighbors. It's opposed now to the contemporary island-like houses designed on large plots of lands. The small plots were proportional to the size of the street itself. So they did not create this hegemony over the street. And this can be witnessed strongly when two plots of land are joined together with a huge building built over it. Of course, this brings us to the issue of the building size. 52% of the original houses were built to be 2 stories, and 45 of them were only 1-story building. Only the higher buildings were recent additions to the buildings, and we can see through the sketch the proportional size between the houses, the original houses themselves, and the width of the street, the scale of the buildings, and the vegetation. Buildings were designed from the start with an outdoor space. Those spaces were not byproduct in the design. Why? Because Jabal Hussein in the first was an agricultural area. It was rich with fruitful trees. So people, when they embraced those designs, it was essential to them to have a generous outdoor space with fruitful trees with the produce. These spaces were also for socializing between neighborhoods, and they offered privacy in the streets. So when you walk in these streets, when we have this tour in Web Day the other day, you really witness the shift between the very loud space, the very loud street when it is new area, then the very serene and calm area when you reach into these old historic cores. For the composition, the returning architects carried with them experience, observation, education, but their designs were influenced by many other regional factors. So the dialogue between knowledge and context is noticed in these compositions. There were early designs where you can see they were still experiencing with the forms, with the texture, with the materials, and with the colors. And then more elaborate designs where you can see that they used modern techniques, cantilevers. They were more, we can notice more breaking the box and more some of the international style. Some of the buildings, most of these buildings are small. And dynamic, and we can see how dynamic the house to the right. They used cantilevers above openings. It is very small cantilevers, but it is noticeable all around the houses. Now, communication with the city, it is very interesting, this thing. They were designed to enjoy a strong relationship with the city, which was only accepted after a shift in people's life, after this shift has occurred. When they acquired this new openness, people themselves started to acquire this openness. This relationship was created through balconies, porches, terraces, wide windows, and sit-back gardens where people enjoyed their rich summer lives. I mean, when we go back to the composition, we can notice the details. There is an intensive care of details, whether in the composition itself or in the way they communicate these buildings with the city. It evokes a feeling that these houses were designed for living. They were not merely residential buildings that were designed by any architect. Yani, it shows how they really sensitive to the details. I tried to do typology to the buildings. They go to the early Ammani modern houses, but some of them to the Ammani modern houses. Some of them are early Ammani modern houses, and the others are late Ammani modern houses. So the early Ammani modern houses, they were trying at first to move away from the three-bay plan, but they still, to some extent, adhere to it. They experienced with some cantilevers, some change in the texture. Some of them used the porches, but mainly they took the same shape. Then we can see the more elaborate or more bold later Ammani modern houses. They used they were more to the prestigious houses in Jabal Hussein with larger areas and more complex plan, moving away from the three-bay houses, but usually still keeping the porch idea and sometimes the round shapes. And of course, sometimes they had this interesting solid void relationships. Now, the physical condition, I tried to assess to some extent the physical condition of these buildings. This is the same house that we saw before. Mainly the physical condition, this is the same house to the right. So this house is not abandoned. So the bad physical condition in these houses is not due to vacancy. The problem is the challenges that people in these houses are changing. Maintaining these houses is very expensive. So this is a question that we have to answer, that if we are to maintain these historical cores, what can we do? I'm actually dealing with this problem in one of the houses in Jabal Hussein, where people are asking themselves, they inherited this house and they don't know what to do with it. They actually are thinking of demolishing it because it's not feasible. And I don't know how to convince them, actually. It's a challenge. And finally, additions and alterations. This is my whole presentation is all about this. If we don't understand how these buildings were conceived from the very beginning, how this project formed, knowing what are the socio-cultural dimensions of these buildings before their tangible features, before thinking of their tangible features, we have to understand why and how they were conceived. We will never be able to signify them and then protect them and raise awareness about them and teach people how to approach them and protect them. Actually, I was planning to do recommendations after this, but I think that this is enough. This is the whole project of modernity. It should be approached as such and nothing less. If we don't understand how this project was formed, then will we end up with such additions that do not understand the logic behind these buildings? That will dominate the whole street. I mean, this building ruined the whole experience of all the neighbors. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a very good summary of what we saw 2 days ago. It puts what we saw in a sort of, good frame. And for us, for all of us, we were in the tour with Rami and with you. It's really very interesting. So, questions? Comments?
I think we are burdened with the idea that we are restorers and architects and we want to protect everything. This is, I can see it with your presentation, with your critical take on the people's actions, which I see part of the process. You cannot just put your aesthetics in front of the whole process. Yeah. So I would shift your critique to the legislation and campaigning and awareness. Because if we don't have a legislation that protects the spirit or protects the area as a landscape, not only architecture, then we'll end up by destroying it and constructing something new. And we cannot do a legislation without real consciousness about the importance of this Jabal Hussein. So I think it's all, you have to start from the teaching and the education system, and then go to the media, and then go to the legislative council, the parliament, and tell them that we have something that's rigorous and we need to protect, and then they might do a plan, which they color it with the green, and then protect it and save it for a while, like what they did with Beirut and Jubmezi, stopped channeling the real estate to developers in order to wait until we think about it. That's a comment.
You want to answer before? Or?
No, I'm totally with
okay.
him. Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure.
Thank you so much, Sura, for this interesting presentation. Also, the link between the statement of Tariq Al-Arish, the definition he gives, and then how it led to Amman. I was wondering how the continuity will be drawn in your presentation. So yeah, thank you also for talking about this narrative of architecture. And I think it's also another tool that could be also convincing even the owners of this last building you showed us that are willing to demolish it instead of intervening on it. You know, these narratives can help us not only in a fetishistic way, because we want to know about how these alteration or transformation were carried out in the past, but also because they can be helpful to anticipate or maybe to design better in a different way. I had a question about designations, since you mentioned the space of the ladies, etc., and the Arabic designations of the different places. I don't know if you were interested about that in your research. And I don't know about the main room, about the salon, etc. I don't know if these terms came up in your research somehow.
Yeah, it was mentioned in many of the interviews that I had in Jabal Hussein. It's common, I think, all around Amman, these designations. There is the salon that is used. It was different before than now. Before it was more active because people had these very active social relationships. Women had those very fascinating, interesting weekly meetings, and men had their those political debates. But now I think that it is completely shifted. We have this abandoned salon that usually kids use for studying, and sometimes it's left only for Eids. So going again to the social way of building these houses, why those salons were created. The owner insisted of having these large salons because he had an idea. He had a reason behind this. Now we insist on having these large salons, but we don't know why. To impress people, only to impress people, and then it's abandoned all around the year, only on Eids. Yeah.
Just on the last comment, I agree totally, because I mean that architecture was very much linked with how these houses were experienced and lived. And I just wanted to, I mean, I was born in '65 and I experienced that to a certain extent. What I refer to as الدور الحضري الاجتماعي للجبل, basically, the urban societal role of these houses and of the mountain. And many of these spaces reconceptualize the meaning of public space, where the public space extends from the salon to the transitional spaces, into the setback gardens, into the, and you've mentioned that in your presentation as well. So I think this is extremely important, and this is a time when people interacted more, and there was more interaction between neighbors, and also more interaction between the private and the public realm in the city. And unfortunately, we're starting gradually to lose that, which is affecting as well people's relationships within the city. So I think, I mean, it's very important to think of these houses and how they were designed vis-a-vis the communication with the city. communication with the city, not only from a composition and physical perspective, but also from a how they were lived, basically, and the interaction with the other, basically.
Thank you, Sura, for this interesting presentation. I just want to add some comments regarding Jabal Hussein. I agree with you that Jabal Hussein was neglected, and it has a lot of importance in the life of Amman. We should go back to the 60s and 70s when Jabal Hussein was the elitist place where there was no Abdoun, there was no Shmisani, there was no Rabia. Jabal Hussein was the center of development. And I remember the circle which called Maxim Circle, Douar Maxim, as a name taken from the restaurant of Maxim. And then, of course, later on, they have changed it into Douar Firas. And then there's this square where Douar Sukaina, with all these urban spaces that has attracted people from different places into Jabal Hussein. And Jabal Hussein was more of a vibrant urban life for not only the residents of the Jabal, but for the whole Amman, because at that time, Amman was shifting from downtown to the first Jabal, let's say, which is Al-Hussein. Later on, it moved into other places like Shmisani, and then Abdoun and Rabia and Sofiya, and going on. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you, Sura, again. I think you touched upon a very interesting issue. This, I don't know if we can call it teaching or informing the client about evolution and about additions to an existing building. I mean, I've worked on several projects that dealt with stubborn or non-informed clients when it comes to their houses. Which brings us back a bit to the discussion yesterday, which is that maybe architecture is not just about design anymore, but it's a bit about anthropology, about sociology, this idea of having a discourse that could actually move out of this academic maybe sphere into more, I would say, less complex ways of channeling these thoughts into homeowners, because this is the dynamic of how the city evolves. It's not just the architects. I mean, we're setting ourselves this role of keeper of a memory of the evolution of the city, but a big part of that, I think Rami touched upon it, it's the communication. To be able to have part of the education should be about being able to materialize these thoughts in a proper discourse that is easily communicative to clients mostly.
Thank you, Sura. My comment, not question, is about the role of the legislations and the role of Greater Amman municipality in protecting or in preserving these houses. We know that there is a department in GAM concerning the heritage or the old houses built since 1950s or 40s or beyond. So I think it was useful to have some guests from GAM to hear all this great discussion and see all these presentations, and to know what to do with the buildings, because it's not enough to say this is a heritage building and stop everything as GAM is doing now. but because it's delaying the people using and the owners of these houses, and because it's not useful to still freeze this building in time and do nothing about it. So I think it was useful to invite some officials from GAM to hear what you said and everybody said, and know what to do in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. You are totally right, because there is this building in Jabal Hussein that is giving grade B, so it is not to be demolished. However, the owners of the house, they are totally aware of its significance. They don't want to demolish it, but they don't have the economic ability to conserve it. They don't know. They want to turn it into a boutique hotel, or to at least renovate it and to still be an apartment building, but they don't know what to do. There's no facilitation from the government. They only say you can't demolish it, but it's a dead end. You are totally right. Yeah.
One last question.
السلام عليكم. ياسر غنام, Jordan Engineers Association. Just one of the monuments in Jabal al-Hussein, the Al-Hussein refugee camp, which is another style. It's another style of heritage of Jabal Hussein and Amman, which I know it started after the 1948. So this is it should cover. We should cover this place as part of Jabal Al Hussein. Thank you for your good lecture. Thank you.
Yes, you are right. I started with Jabal Hussein as a whole area, but as I was working only alone, I had to narrow down the survey area, so I did not cover the whole area. I only restricted my work on a very small area, and I ended up with around 100 buildings, so maybe in the future.
Okay. I have one comment. Okay, I think everybody agrees that protection does not mean freezing, and that protection should integrate the possibility of addition, transformation, etc., etc. This is normal. However, I think we should distinguish between this type of life of a house or of a building, which is a normal life. I mean, a building transforms, evolves, there are additions, you can add floors, etc. And the other process, which is a process of economic process of speculation. This is something different. When you enter into speculation, there is no more the idea of transformation or addition. It's becoming something else totally. It's another process, it's other dynamism, it's other things. So we should always distinguish between both and know what we want to protect. I mean, this is it.